cry when my grandmother died. I think about that sometimes, how I stood in the hospital hallway holding a paper cup of cold coffee, listening to my aunt make phone calls and felt nothing except a strange, hollow quiet. Like the world had pressed pause. What I felt instead came 3 weeks later, sitting in a parking garage in Mississauga, reading a text from my cousin that said, "Gran left the house to me. Just thought you should know. Just thought you should know." I had moved into my grandmother's house on Elmridge Crescent when I was 26. That was 4 years before she died. My marriage had ended, I was between jobs, and Gran called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Stop paying rent to a stranger, come home." She meant her home. She'd been living alone since my grandfather passed, and the house was too big and too quiet, and she was too proud to say she was scared. So I came. I unpacked 2 suitcases and a box of books into the spare bedroom and told myself it was temporary. It wasn't temporary. For 4 years, I drove her to her cardiologist appointments at Trillium Health. I sorted her medications into the little weekly pill organizer, the pink one she'd had since before I was born. I learned how to cook the things she could still eat after her gallbladder surgery: soft foods, low sodium, nothing fried. I sat with her through 2 winters when the cold made her joints so bad she couldn't manage the stairs alone. I watched her favorite shows with her, the old British mysteries she loved, the ones where everyone speaks very properly and the murderer is always someone respectable. We watched a lot of those. My cousin visited at Christmas. Sometimes Easter. She lived 40 minutes away in Oakville, which isn't far, but it felt far. She was busy. She had her husband's family, her spin classes, her renovation projects. I understood. I didn't keep score, or I tried not to. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that 2 months before Gran died, my cousin had driven her to a law office in Burlington and had her sign a new will. I found out the way you find out things like that now. A text message in a parking garage. My cousin's name is Larissa. She's 3 years older than me, and she has the kind of confidence that fills a room before she even speaks. Growing up, I always felt slightly smaller around her. Not because she was cruel, exactly, but because she was so certain about everything, and I was never certain about anything. Gran loved us both. She said that. She meant it. But Larissa was the one who went to university on a full scholarship, who married well, who showed up at family events with the right bottle of wine and a story that made everyone laugh. I was the one who moved back in. When Gran started declining, really declining, not just the slow fade of old age, but the sharper drop that comes when the body starts making decisions, I was the one who called the palliative care coordinator. I was the one who met with the social worker, who talked to the pharmacist about the pain management, who learned what a PICC line was and how to help manage it. I was the one who slept with my door open in case she called out in the night. Larissa came the last week. She sat by the bed and held Gran's hand and cried, and it was real. I don't think it wasn't real. But she hadn't been there for the Tuesday appointments or the 2 a.m. falls or the weeks when Gran didn't know who I was and I sat beside her anyway and read her the weather report, because the sound of a familiar voice seemed to help. Gran died on a Saturday morning in October. The maple in the front yard had gone completely red. I remember noticing it from the window and thinking she would have liked to see it. The will was read 6 weeks later. My aunt hosted it at her condo in Etobicoke. She printed out a copy of the document and laid it on her dining room table like it was a contract to be signed, not a life to be divided. Gran's estate wasn't enormous, but it was real. The house on Elmridge, worth somewhere around $780,000 in the current market. Her savings account at TD Bank, her jewelry, including the pieces from my great-grandmother, and a small investment account my grandfather had set up decades ago. The lawyer spoke. I listened, and then I understood what I was hearing. The house went to Larissa. Outright, along with 60% of the financial accounts. I received the jewelry, which I was grateful for genuinely, and a portion of the investment account. My aunt received a bequest for the remaining savings. Nobody mentioned the 4 years. I didn't say anything in that room. I sat very still, and I looked at the table, and I thought about all the things I could say, and I didn't say any of them. Because what do you say? Gran was of sound mind. She had every right. The will was signed and witnessed and notarized by a firm in Burlington, and everything was in order. What I said eventually was that I needed some air, and I went and stood in the hallway by the elevator bank and stared at the fire extinguisher on the wall. Larissa came out after a few minutes. She looked not guilty, satisfied maybe. The way you look when something you'd been waiting for has finally been confirmed. I know this is hard, she said, but Glenn and I had a lot of conversations this last year. She wanted me to have the house. I thought about asking when those conversations happened. I thought about a lot of things. Okay, I said. She went back inside. I stood in the hallway for another few minutes. Then I took the elevator down, walked to my car, and sat there for a long time without starting the engine. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Miss, I'm so sorry about your grandmother. Could we speak? My name is Bernard O.C. I'm a former colleague of your grandfather's. I stared at it. I almost didn't respond. I almost deleted it and drove home and started packing boxes. But it was raining, and I didn't want to drive in the rain, so I sat there. And I read the text again and I typed back, "How did you get my number?" He replied, "Your grandmother gave it to me. Before she passed, she said to contact you if anything seemed." And here I am quoting her. Not right. I met Bernard O'Say the next afternoon at a Tim Hortons near Square One. I got there first, found a table in the corner, and waited. I'd looked him up the night before. He was 71. Retired now, but he'd spent 35 years as a chartered accountant, and before that he'd worked with a firm that did estate and probate work. He and my grandfather had been colleagues in the 80s. The photo on his old LinkedIn profile showed a serious-looking man in a dark suit. The man who walked in was in a wheelchair. He was smaller than I'd expected, not frail exactly, but diminished in the way that sometimes happens after illness. He had a careful way of moving, deliberate. He found my table without trouble and settled himself across from me and ordered a coffee when the server came by, and then he looked at me and said, "You look like her. Your grandmother. Around the eyes." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said thank you. "She contacted me in August," he said. "After your cousin had taken her to Burlington. She was troubled. She didn't use the word coerced, but she described a conversation that concerned me." I set down my cup. "What kind of conversation?" He was quiet for a moment. Larissa had told her that the house would have to be sold if she, your grandmother, died without updating the will. That there would be probate complications, tax implications. That the family would lose a significant portion of the estate to legal fees. He paused. None of that was accurate. I stared at him. Your grandmother's existing will was straightforward. The house was already structured in a way that would have transferred cleanly. There were no complications. What your cousin told her was at minimum a significant misrepresentation. The words sat between us. "She was scared," I said. "It came out quieter than I intended. Gran hated the idea of causing problems, of leaving a mess." "Yes," he said. "That's what I understood." He placed a folder on the table. "I'm not in a position to tell you what to do. I'm an old man who made a promise to a friend. But I spent 30 years in this field. And what I can tell you is that a will signed under circumstances involving misrepresentation, particularly when the testator is elderly and in declining health, is not necessarily the last word." I looked at the folder. "What's in there?" "Her original will. A copy she gave me years ago for safekeeping. And some notes from our conversations this past August, which I wrote down contemporaneously." He pushed it toward me. "I also have the name of a lawyer who specializes in will challenges in Ontario, if you want it." I didn't pick up the folder right away. I looked out the window at the parking lot. It was grey and flat and very ordinary. A woman was loading grocery bags into her trunk. A kid on a bike was cutting across the lot. "Why would Gran give you a copy of her will?" I asked. He smiled a little. "Because she trusted me. And because she knew her family." He picked up his coffee. "She also told me in August that she was angry at herself for letting Larissa take her to Burlington without telling you first. She said, and again, I'm quoting, 'I didn't want to fight. I always hate the fighting.'" I felt something crack open in my chest. That was so exactly her. That was so completely her. "She loved you both," he said. That wasn't in question. But she told me that she felt the conversation in Burlington had happened very fast, and that she hadn't fully understood what she was signing, and that she hadn't had time to think. I picked up the folder. The next 6 weeks were the most exhausting of my life. And I say that as someone who spent 4 years as an informal caregiver. The lawyer Bernard referred me to was a woman named Constance, who had an office in downtown Toronto, and a manner so precise and calm it was almost unsettling. She reviewed everything: the original will, Bernard's notes, the Burlington will, the timeline, and told me that I had grounds to challenge on the basis of undue influence. "This doesn't mean you'll win," she said clearly. "I want you to understand that will challenges in Ontario are difficult. Courts don't like to overturn a deceased person's stated wishes. But the combination of factors here, the timing, your grandmother's documented health decline, the misrepresentation of legal consequences, gives us a reasonable foundation." I asked her what it would cost. She told me. I didn't sleep well for several nights after that. I had to make a decision without knowing the outcome. That's the thing nobody tells you about choosing to fight. You have to spend real resources, real time, real emotional energy on something that might not go the way you need it to go. There are no guarantees. There's just what you know to be true and whether you can afford to stand behind it. I decided I could. My aunt was the variable I hadn't anticipated. She'd received her portion of the estate without complaint. She'd always been practical, my aunt, more interested in resolution than drama. But when I called her and told her what Bernard had told me, and what Constance had explained about the Burlington meeting, she went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I always thought it was strange." She mentioned Burlington to me once in passing. She seemed confused about why they'd gone. "Did you ask Larissa about it?" "I did," she said. Larissa said Gran had brought it up herself, that Gran had been worried about the will for months. Another pause. "But your grandmother never mentioned it to me." "Not once. And we talked every week." My aunt agreed to provide a witness statement. What I hadn't expected was Larissa's lawyer. His name was Mitchell, and he was smooth in the way that certain lawyers are smooth. Not warm, exactly, but fictionless. He'd clearly handled situations like this before. When Constance opened the mediation session with Bernard's contemporaneous notes and the timeline discrepancy, Mitchell took 30 seconds to review it and then asked for a brief recess. He came back and said his client was open to a negotiated resolution. I looked across the table at Larissa. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the window, the same way I'd looked at the parking lot at Tim Hortons, like she was calculating something. "What does that mean, practically?" I said. Constance put her hand briefly on my forearm, a small professional gesture. What it meant, practically, was this. Larissa would retain the house, but the financial accounts would be redistributed according to the original will, which meant my share increased substantially. Additionally, there would be an acknowledgement, in writing, that my 4 years as a live-in caregiver constituted quantifiable contribution to the estate, something the Ontario courts have recognized in related case law, and a compensatory figure would be calculated. The number they eventually agreed to was not small. I didn't celebrate. I want to be clear about that. I sat in Constance's office after Mitchell and Larissa left, and I drank a glass of water, and I felt very tired and very sad in a way I hadn't quite expected. Because even when you're right, even when the outcome is just, what you've lost doesn't come back. My grandmother was still gone. The 4 years were still over. The version of the future where none of this had happened, where Dran had died and we'd all grieved together, and Larissa and I had maybe sat on the porch of the house on Elm Ridge and been sad together. That future was also gone. Constance asked if I was all right. "Yes," I said. And then, "I don't know." She nodded like that was a reasonable answer. The strangest part of the whole thing came later, and it's the part I think about most. A month after the mediation, I went back to the Tim Hortons near Square One to meet Bernard again, just to tell him what had happened. He deserved to know. He was already there when I arrived, at the same table in the corner. He looked tired. He'd been dealing with some health issues, he mentioned. Nothing dramatic, but tiring. His coffee was already half gone. I told him everything. The mediation, the outcome, the numbers. He listened without interrupting, which I'd come to recognize as his habit. When I finished, he said, "Your grandmother would be pleased." "I think she'd be sad," I said. "She hated conflict." "She hated injustice more," he said. "She just didn't always know it was allowed to say so." I thought about that for a while. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." Why did she trust you with the original will? You hadn't been in contact for years, had you? He turned his coffee cup slowly. No. She reached out to me in the spring, before Burlington. She'd been thinking about her affairs, as people do. We reconnected, had some phone calls. He paused. She was a remarkable woman. Very sharp, even then. She knew the difference between a conversation and a manipulation. She knew, afterward, that something had felt wrong in Burlington. She just didn't know what to do about it, because she didn't want to hurt Larissa. She was protecting her, I said. Even at the end, he said, yes. I looked at him, this quiet, careful man in his wheelchair who had kept a promise to a dead woman and driven himself through Mississauga traffic to sit in a Tim Hortons and hand a folder to a stranger who had done it for no reason except that someone he respected had asked him to. Thank you, I said. I mean that. He waved it off in the way that older people sometimes do when they don't want to be thanked. A small dismissive gesture that means the opposite of dismissal. Don't thank me. Just make sure the house on Elridge goes to someone who deserves it. It's not going to me, I said. Larissa's keeping it. He looked at me steadily. I wasn't talking about the house. I didn't know what to say to that. I looked out the window at the parking lot again. It was December now, snow coming. The trees were bare. She left me the maple, I said. It came out of nowhere. I hadn't planned to say it. He tilted his head. In the original will, the one from before Burlington, it's a tree, a maple in the front yard. It's not transferable, obviously, but she left me a note about it. I stopped, started again. She wrote that the maple was the best thing about that house and she wanted me to know I'd given her 4 years of the same. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. There it is, he said quietly. Outside, the first snow of December was starting to fall. Small flakes, unhurried. The parking lot turned slowly white. I didn't cry in that Tim Hortons, but it was a close thing. I drove home with my grandmother's note in my coat pocket and the heater going and the radio on low, and I thought about all the Tuesday appointments and the Pink Pill organizer and the British mysteries and the October maple and the particular silence of a house where someone used to be. And I thought, I didn't do any of it for a house. I did it because she was my grandmother and she called me on a Tuesday and said, come home. And I went. That part, at least, nobody could take. I've thought a lot about the maple tree since then. Not the house, not the money, not the mediation outcome. The maple. The fact that my grandmother sat down and wrote a note about a tree in her front yard and left it for me. Because she wanted me to know that she had seen me. That's the part that undoes me a little, even now. People talk about karma like it's some automatic system running in the background, tallying up your good deeds and your bad ones, and eventually handing out receipts. I don't think it works like that. What I think, and this is just what this experience taught me, I'm not claiming anything universal, is that the choices you make when nobody is watching, when there's nothing in it for you, when you're just doing what needs to be done because someone you love needs it done, those choices have weight. They accumulate. Not always in ways you can predict or plan for, but they leave marks. I didn't move into that house on Elmridge because I expected anything. I moved in because my grandmother asked and I said yes. I drove her to Trillium Health because the appointments needed to happen. I sorted the Pink Pill organizer because it was Tuesday and it was time. None of it was heroic. Morning after wedding, I opened my banking app out of kind that doesn't make for your good story while you're doing it because it's just Tuesday, and then it's Wednesday, and then 6 months have passed. What I learned is that integrity isn't a single decision. It's not one dramatic moment where you stand up and do the right thing. It's the accumulation of small, boring, unglamorous decisions made over a long stretch of time. When you're tired, when nobody's watching, when the person you're caring for doesn't always remember your name that day. That's the real test of character, I think. Not the crisis, the Tuesday. And then there's Bernard. A 71-year-old man who made a promise to a woman he'd known for decades, kept it after she died, drove himself through Mississauga traffic, and handed a folder to a stranger in a Tim Hortons. He didn't know how it would turn out. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because someone he respected had trusted him, and he took that seriously. That kind of quiet, determined follow-through, honoring a commitment even when the person who asked is no longer there to know whether you kept it. That's something I want to carry with me. The hardest part of this whole thing wasn't the mediation or the legal costs or even the grief of losing my grandmother. The hardest part was deciding to fight at all. Because fighting meant accepting that my family was broken in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself. It meant spending money I didn't have on an outcome I couldn't guarantee. It meant sitting across a table from my cousin and watching her not look at me and knowing that whatever relationship we'd had was now something different. It took everything I had. Not courage in the dramatic sense, just the quieter kind. The kind where you wake up and make the appointment and show up and keep going even when you're not sure it's going to work. The kind that doesn't feel brave while you're doing it. Only afterward, when you're sitting in a car in December watching the first snow fall on a parking lot and you realize you didn't give up. My grandmother called me on a Tuesday and said, "Come home," and I went. That's still the truest thing I know.